A destined summer in Philadelphia, Philadelphia. May 1787. The city bustled as it always did, yet something in the air felt unusually heavy. The sun beat mercilessly down on cobbled streets, casting long shadows from brick buildings of the Pennsylvania State House red brick structure crowned with a solemn white steeple. This was the building where, 11 years prior, a group of rebels had declared independence from the British Crown. Now it was once again the center of a grand undertaking, perhaps even greater, the crafting of a constitution that might save a fragile and fractured nation. A black carriage came to a slow halt outside the gates. A tall figure descended, no longer wearing his general's uniform, but a plain brown coat. Still, his bearing remained commanding. George Washington had arrived. The hero of the Revolution, the man who refused kingship, walked into the hall with quiet strength and purpose. He nodded politely to those already inside, but his expression remained grave. Washington understood that the men gathering here represented states with clashing interests, deeply held grievances, and little trust in each other. Winning the war had not united them anything. Peace had exposed deeper fault lines. In one corner of the room, a smaller man sat hunched over a stack of meticulously organized notes. His name was James Madison. Though diminutive in stature, with a sharp gaze and frail frame, Madison carried a vision larger than any man in the room. He had spent months studying historical governments and preparing what he hoped would become the foundation of a new American system. For him, this convention was not merely a political gathering. It was the last chance to preserve the Union before it shattered under its own weight. But why was a new constitution necessary at all? The answer lay in the failure of the existing system, the Articles of Confederation. Each issued its own currency, levied tariffs on neighboring states, and routinely ignored requests from the National Congress. There was no executive branch, no federal judiciary, and Congress had no power to tax or enforce laws. This weakness came to a head in 1786 when Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts. A group of indebted farmers, furious over taxes and foreclosures, took up arms. The state government struggled to raise a militia. The federal government stood helpless. To many, this chaos signaled that, without a stronger central authority, the very idea of America might not survive. On May 25, 1787, after several days of delays, 12 of the 13 states, with Rhode Island abstaining in protest, reached quorum, and the Constitutional Convention officially began. Inside the chamber, with thick drapes drawn to block the heat and prying eyes, the delegates elected George Washington as president of the convention. The vote was unanimous. No man in the room commanded greater respect. And no one doubted that his presence gave the gathering an air of purpose and legitimacy it might otherwise have lacked. Washington said little. He rarely participated in debate, but he listened closely, his silent leadership anchoring the room. Soon after, James Madison introduced what became known as the Virginia Plan. It was a bold proposal. A national government with 3 separate branches, legislative, executive, and judicialize, empowered to check the others. The legislative branch would be bicameral, one house with representatives allocated by state population, and another selected indirectly. Madison's plan sought to replace the ineffective articles with a structure capable of governing a real nation. The reaction was immediate and divisive. Delegates from smaller states like New Jersey and Delaware recoiled. They saw the plan as a threat to their sovereignty. If representation were based on population, larger states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts would dominate the national legislature. In response, New Jersey presented an alternative. Each state, regardless of size or population, would have an equal vote. This deadlock between large and small states threatened to unravel the convention before it had even begun. In the midst of the tension, Benjamin Franklin rose to speak. At 81, he was the oldest delegate, frail but wise. His voice, though soft, carried to every corner of the chamber. "We are building a house together," he said. "If every man insists only on protecting his own chamber, the whole structure shall never stand." The room fell quiet. Franklin's words didn't erase disagreement, but they reminded everyone of their shared responsibility. They had not come to Philadelphia to entrench division, but to forge unity, however difficult that might be. For the next several weeks, the convention operated in strict secrecy. Windows remained shut, guards posted, and servants sworn to silence. Outside, the citizens of Philadelphia speculated about what was happening behind the curtained walls. They saw men enter each morning and leave each evening, tired, sweating, often stone-faced. What was being discussed inside was a mystery, but everyone sensed the weight of the moment. Each night, Madison returned to his boarding house and documented everything. His notes became the most comprehensive record of the convention, a service to posterity that revealed the daily struggles, arguments, and fragile compromises that shaped the Constitution. One stormy night in June, as thunder rolled over the city, Madison sat alone at his desk. Candlelight flickered over sheets of parchment. He sketched diagrams, drafted clauses, and wrestled with ideas. How could a government be powerful enough to govern, but not so powerful as to become tyrannical? Madison believed that liberty could only survive within structure. That structure had to be written, clear, and enforceable. The Constitution, he believed, could be a cage of law to contain the dangers of unchecked power. By late June, hope began to emerge from stalemate. Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed a compromise, a bicameral legislature in which the House of Representatives would reflect population, while the Senate would grant each state to vote equal regardless of size. This great compromise was not perfect, but it broke the deadlock and gave the convention a path forward. In July, the heat deepened. The air inside the chamber was thick with ink, sweat, and tension, but no one left. The delegates knew that failure was not an option. If the convention collapsed, the states might break apart. Civil war was not unthinkable. Foreign powers might seize the opportunity to intervene. So they stayed debating, writing, erasing, rewriting. Gradually, article by article, the Constitution took shape. It was a child of exhaustion, argument, and hope. When compromises were made, they were often painful, especially those involving slavery, where politics triumphed over justice. Still, the delegates pressed forward. They did not claim perfection. They only sought survival. On September 17, 1787, after nearly 4 months of deliberation, 39 delegates signed the finished Constitution. As Franklin penned his name, he looked toward Washington's chair, carved with a rising sun. "I have often wondered," he said, "whether that sun was rising or setting. Now I know is a rising sun," and so it was. That long, sweltering summer, marked by frustration, sweat, and sleepless night, gave birth to a document that would outlive them all. Philadelphia had once again become the birthplace of American destiny. Not merely the city of rebellion, but the city of design. The Constitution was not flawless, but in that destined summer of 1787, it was the most enduring gift a group of flawed but visionary men could give to the future. 5 delegates, 13 states, one future. The heavy oak doors of Independence Hall creaked open with the dawn. On that May morning in 1787, Philadelphia was blanketed in the warmth of early summer. But within the grand chamber, tension brewed thicker than the humid air. The Constitutional Convention had officially begun. 55 delegates, statesmen, scholars, merchants, farmers, and war veterans gathered from across the 13 independent states. Some had known one another for years, others only by reputation. Each carried with them the voice and burden of their home state. But, more importantly, each brought a vision, some conflicting, others converging about what the United States of America could become. Among them stood familiar faces. George Washington, recently retired from the Revolutionary War, had been unanimously chosen to preside. His silent presence commanded respect, even reverence. Benjamin Franklin, at 81 years old, was carried to the hall each day, his mind as sharp as ever, despite his frail body. James Madison, though soft-spoken and slight in stature, came armed with meticulous notes and a bold plan for a new national government. Alexander Hamilton, brilliant and fiery, dreamt of a strong central authority to secure America's place in the world. But this was no celebration. It was, from the first gavel to the last sigh of parchment, a battlefield of ideas. 13 realities, 13 visions. Each state had its grievances, its pride, its fears. Virginia, populous and prosperous, believed it should have more weight in decisions. New Jersey, smaller and wary of domination, demanded equal footing. The southern states feared a future where slavery might be outlawed. Northern states, more industrial and commercially driven, feared unchecked expansion of slave power. Frontier states worried about land claims and trade. Urban elites feared the rule of mob democracy, while rural delegates distrusted any remote power seated far from their soil. The debates were heated and relentless. At times, the hall echoed with impassioned speeches. At others, it boiled with whispered side conversations in corners and corridors. Delegates clashed over representation. Should states be equal, or should representation reflect population? Should the executive be singular or plural? Should the federal government have power to tax, to raise armies, to regulate commerce? Some argued for monarchy. Whispers of president for life lingered around Hamilton. Others insisted on a confederation, a loose alliance of sovereign states. Some threatened to walk out. Others quietly plotted compromises. The compromises that forged a nation. Perhaps no agreement was more pivotal than the Great Compromise, engineered by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. It proposed a two-house Congress. The Senate would give each state equal representation, while the House of Representatives would allocate seats based on population. It was imperfect, but it struck a balance that prevented collapse. Next came the 3/5 compromise, agonizing moral concession. Southern states demanded that enslaved people be counted for representation, though not for taxation. Northern delegates resisted. The compromise, each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person. It was a deeply troubling stain on a hopeful document, a compromise that would sow seeds of future conflict. On the presidency, a delicate architecture emerged. A single executive, elected not by direct popular vote, but through an electoral college, a buffer between the will of the people and the power of the office. Some feared tyranny. Others feared chaos. This solution reflected both fears. As the weeks passed, sweat soaked through linen shirts, tempers flared and cooled, and ideas were tested, reshaped, and reformed. The process was grueling, but something remarkable began to happen. These 55 men, from vastly different backgrounds and interests, began to mold something no nation had attempted on such a scale before. A republic founded not on monarchy or aristocracy, but on a charter of law. Behind closed doors, the proceedings were secret. Windows were shut, guards stationed outside, and newspapers barred from reporting details. Delegates feared that premature leaks would spark public outrage or destroy fragile negotiations. Even Franklin, a known talker, was gently reminded not to discuss details in public. Yet, within those sealed walls, history was being written. Madison's meticulous notes captured it all. He recorded the arguments, the motions, the shifting alliances. His Virginia plan had set the framework, calling for a strong national government with 3 separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. This idea, radical to many, eventually gained acceptance. Day after day, delegates returned, debated, compromised. And every evening, they wandered the streets of Philadelphia, discussing politics over ale, exchanging letters with governors back home, reflecting by candlelight in boarding rooms. The city, once host to revolution, now witnessed the birth of an entirely new experiment. Unity through division by midsummer. Exhaustion was visible on every face. Some delegates had already left, frustrated or ill. But those who remained understood the gravity of their task. They weren't just building a government. They were creating a foundation, one that had to last not just for their time, but for generations unborn. They argued not for themselves, but for an unknown future. On September 17, 1787, after months of labor, the final draft of the Constitution was presented. Some refused. George Mason objected to the lack of a Bill of Rights. Edmund Randolph and Elbridge Gerry feared federal overreach. But enough agreed. The document, with its preamble beginning, "We, the people," would now be sent to the states for ratification. As the delegates filed out of Independence Hall for the last time, Franklin was asked by a curious woman outside, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A monarchy or a republic?" He replied with a faint smile, "A republic if you can keep it." The weight of ink and vision, the United States Constitution was more than a legal document. It was a mirror of compromise, a reflection of hope, a gamble on human reason and unity. Crafted in secrecy, tempered by fierce debate, and born in a sweltering hall by imperfect men, it was never meant to be perfect, but it was alive. It created a government strong enough to unify, yet restrained enough to prevent tyranny. It enshrined principles that would evolve freedom, justice, representation, while leaving space for amendments, for change, for growth. 55 men had entered that chamber, divided by state lines and personal ambition. But when they emerged, they had authored a future uncertain, fragile, but full of possibility. And thus, 13 states, through blood, debate, and quill found one voice, a voice that would echo through time. The debate begins. Dreams in disagreement, the Philadelphia summer in 1787 bore witness not only to the sweltering heat and the buzzing of flies through windows left open for air, but to the fire of ideas clashing within the four walls of independence. Hall, the dreams of 13 states had come together in one room, and though they all desired a stronger union, the path to that union was anything but smooth. On May 31st, the debates began in earnest. Delegates sat stiffly on wooden benches, sweat dripping under their powdered wigs. Drafted by James Madison, the plan proposed a national government with 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Most importantly, it envisioned a bicameral legislature with representation based on state population or financial contribution. This bold proposal, while rooted in logic and long consideration, stirred immediate resistance. Smaller states such as Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut saw in it the seeds of domination. If representation is by population, protested William Paterson of New Jersey, then what becomes of the equality we fought for? The room tensed. The debates revealed deeper fractures beneath the surface. It wasn't simply a question of large versus small states. It was a conflict of philosophies, fears, and dreams. Some feared monarchy in disguise. Others feared mob rule. Some sought a strong federal government to unify the country and manage trade, currency, and diplomacy. Others clung fiercely to the independence of their states, earned through years of bloody revolution. On June 15th, Paterson introduced the New Jersey Plan as a countermeasure. It proposed a single-house legislature where each state had one vote, preserving the model of the Articles of Confederation. In Paterson's voice rang the apprehensions of smaller states, the fear of being swallowed up by giants like Virginia and Pennsylvania. For days, tempers flared. George Mason argued passionately for the protection of individual rights. Gouverneur Morris warned of aristocracy and urged for direct election of senators. James Wilson championed the people's voice, insisting that any new government must be rooted in the consent of the governed, not merely the states. And yet, despite the heat, despite the tension, there was an undercurrent of resolve, a desire to not let this fragile union shatter under the weight of disagreement. By mid-June, the debates had become both philosophical and deeply personal. Behind closed doors, Alexander Hamilton delivered a bold 6-hour speech proposing a government more closely modeled on the British system, a lifetime president, a strong executive. While few supported his vision, his speech served as a powerful reminder of the need to be bold, to dare to envision stability and unity in a continent that had known little of it. Still, the deadlock remained. It was then, in late June, that the air in the room began to shift. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, quiet, deliberate, rose and offered what would later be called the Great Compromise. His plan: a bicameral legislature, with proportional representation in the lower house and equal representation in the upper house. The House of Representatives would reflect the people. The Senate would protect the states. This idea, a bridge between dreams, did not solve all problems, but it introduced hope. Over the next days, discussion pivoted toward details. How would representation be determined? How would taxes be levied? How would power be divided between the federal government and the states? And yet, the thorniest issue loomed ahead: slavery. In whispered voices, the delegates turned to this moral and economic dilemma. Southern states wanted enslaved persons counted toward representation. Though not taxation, Northern delegates balked. James Wilson proposed the infamous compromise for representation purposes. Enslaved individuals would be counted as 3/5 of a person, a bitter concession, but one deemed necessary to keep the Southern states at the table. Still, not all were satisfied. Luther Martin of Maryland stormed out in protest. Others, like Elbridge Gerry, voiced moral outrage. But the debate pressed on, driven by the belief that unity must survive, even if imperfect. In the back of the room, Benjamin Franklin, frail, older than the others, yet sharp as ever, occasionally offered wisdom wrapped in wit. When a broad table is to be made, he once said, the joints must be fitted. You will therefore permit me to observe that I think this compromise is a necessary one. And so, through weeks of disagreement, a strange alchemy took place. Conflict began to forge consensus. The delegates were learning to bend, not break. They realized that no one would leave Philadelphia with everything they wanted, but perhaps with something they could believe in. By the end of July, the debate had reached a new maturity. The Constitution, still a work in progress, now had shape: 2 houses of Congress, an executive branch with a president chosen through an electoral college, and a judiciary that would interpret laws. The seeds of checks and balances, of separation of powers, were now rooted. But more than any structure, what was forming in Philadelphia was a testament to the power of dialogue. Behind every fiery speech and every compromise was a shared dream: that out of many states, one nation might emerge, free, enduring, and just. And though the debates would continue into August, into September, Chapter 3 had revealed the core of the convention: that the American experiment would be born not from agreement, but from argument. Not from unity of thought, but unity of purpose. In the heart of that humid summer, with ink-stained fingers and weary minds, 55 delegates began to draw the first lines of a future never seen before. And in doing so, they proved that disagreement, when met with patience and principle, could still give birth to dreams. Madison, the silent architect, while the heated debates filled the rooms of Independence Hall and delegates from different states clashed with fiery speeches, one man remained notably quiet, yet his mind was constantly at work. James Madison's small in stature, modest in demeanor, and soft-spoken in conversation, was not the loudest voice in the room. But make no mistake, he was shaping the very bones of the nation. From the moment he arrived in Philadelphia, Madison came armed, not with force, but with foresight. Tucked in his coat were meticulously prepared notes, ideas refined from years of study, and most importantly, a plan, the Virginia Plan. Though it would later be debated, amended, and reshaped, the Virginia Plan formed the core of what would become the United States Constitution. Madison had come not only to listen, but to design. Madison's vision was rooted in deep understanding. He had read, voraciously studying, every system of government from ancient Athens to the modern British Empire. He was painfully aware of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. In his view, the United States was a house with a crumbling foundation. No strong central government, no power to tax, no unified defense. If left unchanged, he feared the structure would collapse entirely. But rather than deliver fiery monologues, Madison worked quietly behind the scenes. He built coalitions, formed compromises, and gathered allies among the delegates. He found common ground between large and small states, northern merchants and southern planters, revolutionaries and moderates. While others debated, Madison listened, noted every argument, and recalibrated. Each morning, he arrived early, sitting in the front row of the hall, pen in hand, noting every word spoken. His detailed notes, written in a small, neat hand, would later become the most comprehensive record of the Constitutional Convention. Without them, much of what occurred in that summer of 1787 would have been lost to time. He could anticipate objections before they were raised. He could see the logic in opposing arguments and craft solutions that addressed multiple concerns. When delegates raised the issue of state sovereignty, he proposed a federal system that balanced national authority with local control. When the debate turned to representation, he helped navigate the compromises that led to the bicameral Congress. To some, his quiet demeanor was a mystery. How could such a soft-voiced man command such influence? But to those who watched closely, the answer was clear. Madison wielded knowledge like a sword, precision like a scalpel. He wasn't there to dominate, he was there to build. One night, as candles flickered low and most delegates had retired, Madison remained seated at a desk, scribbling in his journal. The room was quiet, but his mind was alive. Across from him, George Washington, now presiding, over the convention, watched in silence. He knew Madison's importance, perhaps more than anyone. Washington, the warrior and symbol, gave legitimacy to the gathering. But Madison was its engineer. It was also Madison who championed the idea of checks and balances, ensuring that no branch of government could overpower the others. His model was based on realism. He understood human ambition. If men were angels, he would later write in the Federalist Papers, no government would be necessary. It was not about trusting leaders. As the convention dragged on, frustration grew. Compromise came slowly, if at all. Tempers flared. Some threatened to walk out. Yet Madison remained calm. He reminded his fellow delegates that they were not simply building a government for 13 states, they were crafting a future for generations to come. There were moments when his resolve was tested. The debate over slavery haunted him. While he personally opposed the institution, he knew that any attempt to abolish it outright would fracture the fragile alliance of states. The moral weight of that compromise weighed on him then and for the rest of his life. He often wondered whether history would judge their silence on slavery as betrayal. Yet Madison pressed on, understanding the fragile balance between idealism and pragmatism. He knew that the Constitution would not be perfect, but it had to be strong enough to survive, unflexible enough to evolve. When the final document was signed in September, Madison stood to the side. Others received the applause, the handshakes, the toasts. But Madison was not looking for glory. His reward was knowing that the structure he had quietly helped shape would hold. That the threads he had woven between conflicting interests had, at last, formed a fabric strong enough to bind a nation. Later, when the Constitution faced fierce opposition in the states, it was Madison again who stepped forward, might with brilliance, alongside Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. He wrote the Federalist Papers series of essays that explained, defended, and clarified the new Constitution. His words helped sway opinion in New York, Virginia, and beyond. His pen became his most powerful weapon. Even then, Madison remained humble. He did not see himself as a founder of glory, but as a servant of necessity. Years later, when he would serve as President of the United States, many would look back and realize the quiet man who once sat in the shadows of Philadelphia had been one of the central architects of the American experiment all along. And so, in the great hall where voices once clashed and compromise was carved into parchment, Madison's spirit lingered not in the echoes of speeches, but in the quiet strength of ideas. Ideas that endured, not because they shouted the loudest, but because they were built to last. The Great Compromise, the summer of 1787, in Philadelphia had already witnessed weeks of intense debate and frustration. The hall of the Pennsylvania State House was filled with sighs, with murmurs and the sharp sound of gavels striking wood as tempers flared. By July, a serious deadlock had emerged. The convention assembled to build a stronger federal government now found itself stumbling over a central question: representation. How would each state have a voice in this new Congress? The answer would change the trajectory of a young nation. The division was clear. The larger states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, believed representation should be based on population. They argued that the more people a state had, the more say it should have in national matters. This was the essence of the Virginia Plan, introduced by Edmund Randolph and shaped behind the scenes by James Madison. Under this plan, a bicameral legislature would be formed, with both houses determined by population. It was a logical structure. You had more citizens, you would naturally deserve more influence. But the smaller states were terrified. To them, such a plan was a recipe for domination. States like Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut saw their voices being drowned in the roar of the more populous states. William Paterson of New Jersey countered with his own proposal, the New Jersey Plan, which called for a unicameral legislature with equal representation for each state. Regardless of size, every state, large or small, would have one vote. For the small states, it was a matter of survival. The debates grew more intense. Delegates accused each other of seeking power, of ignoring justice, of sowing division. Some even whispered about walking out of the convention altogether. The air was heavy with anxiety. The fate of the Union, once forged in common cause against the British Crown, now seemed threatened by internal division. Tempers ran hot, and the dream of a unified constitution appeared to be unraveling. It was then that compromise became the only lifeline. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, a man of modest demeanor but sharp political instinct, stepped forward with a proposal that would become the turning point of the convention. His plan, what history would call the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise, suggested a two-house legislature. The lower house, the House of Representatives, would reflect the Virginia Plan with representation based on population. The upper house, the Senate, would follow the New Jersey Plan with equal representation to senators for each state. At first, the proposal was met with skepticism. Both sides feared they were giving up too much. The large states balked at the idea of smaller states having equal power in the Senate. The small states hesitated, unsure whether the compromise would protect their interests in the long run. But with no better solution in sight, and the very real risk of failure looming, delegates began to soften. Discussions extended late into the night. Notes were scribbled hastily on parchment. Words were tested debated, and revised again and again. Then, on July 16, 1787, the vote was held. With the slimmest of margins, 5 states in favor, 4 against, the Great Compromise passed. The room, once echoing with division, now held the silence of solemn realization. Something extraordinary had just occurred. It was not merely a structural agreement. The compromise represented the beginning of a new political culture, one that accepted that no single vision could triumph completely, that unity required give and take. It was the moment when delegates, despite their deep disagreements, chose country over state, future over pride. From that day, the shape of the Constitution began to take form. With the legislative structure settled, other difficult questions, such as the powers of the president, the role of the judiciary, and how to count enslaved individuals for representation, would still follow. But the breakthrough over representation gave the delegates hope. They had shown they could overcome impasse, that compromise was not weakness but wisdom. Sherman, often overshadowed by louder voices like Madison or Hamilton, had in that moment proved indispensable. His calm proposal, born not from theory but from pragmatic necessity, had saved the convention. He would later become one of the few men to sign all 3 foundational documents of the United States: the Continental Association, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. The Great Compromise also set a precedent. Future generations of lawmakers would return to its spirit when facing their own deadlocks. It taught the lesson that democracy is not about total victory, but about balance between big and small, strong and weak, north and south. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the spire of Independence Hall, many delegates remained seated in quiet reflection. The room still smelled of ink and sweat. The weight of the task ahead remained, but something had shifted. For the first time in weeks, hope felt tangible. Outside, the streets of Philadelphia carried on, unaware of the momentous agreement just struck within those brick walls. But inside, the foundation of a new republic had been laid. One built not on uniformity, but on unity through compromise. The United States, though still in its infancy, had just taken a great and difficult step toward becoming the nation its founders dreamed of. Building the foundation of separation of powers, summer in Philadelphia did not just bring suffocating heat. It brought with it the weight of a nation in the making. As June turned into July, and the clamor in the convention hall echoed endlessly, one idea slowly rose to prominence, an idea destined to shape the destiny of the United States: the separation of powers. If the Constitution was to be a fortress, then this principle would be the very bedrock of its structure. From fear of tyranny to the need for balance for many of the delegates, the memory of British oppression was still vivid. The king's unchecked power had become the symbol of tyranny. They had once shed blood to escape. But just as dangerous as monarchy was the fear of mob rule, of chaos bred by a government too weak to govern. Between these two extremes, they searched for an answer. The solution lay in balance. Not simply dividing authority for the sake of division, but carefully constructing a system where powers would check and restrain each other, preventing any branch from becoming dominant. The three pillars take shape. James Madison, with his quiet demeanor and sharp intellect, was one of the early champions of the idea. He, along with Alexander Hamilton and others influenced by Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu, believed that a republic needed internal boundaries lines drawn not just on maps, but within the very structure of government. Gradually, three great pillars emerged: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. The legislature, the voice of the people at the heart of the new republic, would be Congress, the legislative body, made up of two chambers. The House of Representatives and the Senate would hold the power to make laws, approve budgets, declare war, and oversee the other branches. The House, elected directly by the people, would ensure representation for the population. The Senate, representing states equally, would temper the passions of the majority. This duality was indeed just a compromise. It was a reflection of the nation itself, a union of both people and states, large and small. The executive power with responsibility. Designing the executive branch brought some of the fiercest debates. Some feared placing too much power in the hands of one man, while others argued a single leader was necessary for decisiveness and unity. Would this be a monarch in disguise or a servant of the people? Eventually, the role of the president took form, limited to a 4-year term, subject to impeachment, and bound by the laws passed by Congress. The president would command the military, enforce laws, make treaties with Senate approval, and appoint officials and judges. Strong, yet bound. Independent, yet accountable. The judiciary, guardian of the Constitution. The judicial branch was perhaps the most abstract in early discussions. While everyone agreed that laws must be interpreted and justice upheld, defining the court's exact powers was elusive. It was decided that a Supreme Court would be established, with the power to interpret the Constitution and resolve disputes between states. Although the concept of judicial review wasn't fully spelled out in the text, many delegates believed it was a natural function of the judiciary. The courts would be independent, with judges appointed for life, free from the winds of political change, so that justice could remain steady. Checks and balances. A living web, these three branches were not meant to live in isolation. Instead, they would constantly interact, challenge, and restrain one another. The president could veto laws passed by Congress. Congress could override the veto, impeach the president, and approve or reject appointments. The courts could declare laws or executive actions unconstitutional. And Congress could, in turn, amend the Constitution. This system of checks and balances was like a web of tension, ensuring no branch could act without resistance or scrutiny. It was not designed for speed, but for stability. Not for ease, but for endurance. Debate and compromise behind every brick. The design was not born fully formed. It was sculpted over weeks of debate, redrafted with every disagreement. Delegates like Edmund Randolph feared too much executive power. Others, like Governor Morris, worried that a weak presidency would invite foreign meddling or domestic collapse. Some wanted the judiciary to be tightly controlled. Others insisted on total independence. In the end, the structure was not perfect. It left open questions about the limits of presidential power, about how judges would be selected, about the relationship between federal and state courts. But it was a beginning, a framework that could grow and evolve. A new kind of government for a new kind of nation. As the convention neared its close, the atmosphere changed. There was exhaustion, but also a sense of cautious hope. In building the separation of powers, Benjamin Franklin, old and frail, is said to have looked at the chair behind George Washington, carved with a half-sun on the horizon, remarked that after months of uncertainty, he finally knew it was a rising sun. Legacy, etched in the nation's foundation, what the delegates created in 1787 was more than a political mechanism, was a philosophy, a belief that liberty required limitation, that ambition could be made to check ambition, that even in a republic built on trust in the people, safeguards were necessary to preserve freedom. The separation of powers would not solve every problem, but it would serve as a compass, guiding future generations through crises and change. It was not merely an invention of that summer, it was the nation's spine, a structure still standing centuries later. And as the ink dried on the Constitution, the framers hoped their work would stand not just for a moment, but for all time. The signers of the pen, as the humid summer of 1787 neared its close. The Grand Chamber of Independence Hall in Philadelphia became a theater of silence, tension, and solemnity. Weeks of debate, days of doubt, and hours of fevered compromise had finally culminated in a document that sought not just to unify 13 disjointed states, but to birth a nation from principle. Now, it awaited what seemed like a simple act, but one that carried the weight of history, signatures. On the morning of September 17th, light filtered through the tall windows of the assembly room, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floor. Around the green cloth-covered table stood the delegates, some defiant, others reflective. What they were about to do was more than endorse a paper. It was to tether their names to an idea that could either flourish into a new republic or collapse into political ruin. At the front of the room, seated in his high-backed chair, was George Washington. Reserved, composed, and regal in his restraint, he had presided over the convention with quiet authority. Although he had spoken little during the debates, his very presence had anchored the legitimacy of the entire effort. When he rose, a hush fell. He said only a few words, solemn and sparse, but it was his posture, man ready to lend his name to this new charter, that emboldened the others. The first to approach the table was George Washington himself. He signed in bold, confident strokes, George Washington, President and Deputy from Virginia. His signature, positioned prominently at the top, signified not just rank, but conviction. One by one, the other delegates followed. From Pennsylvania came Benjamin Franklin, frail but determined, who had earlier urged unity above all else. He needed help to rise, and when he dipped the quill, he smiled faintly. I agreed to this Constitution with all its faults, he had said the day before, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure it is not the best. Some signed with heavy hearts. Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who had introduced the Virginia Plan, refused to sign. So did George Mason and Elbridge Gerry, troubled by the absence of a Bill of Rights and fears of an overpowered central government. Their absence was noted, their dissent a shadow over the page. Yet 39 men still stepped forward, inked their names, and chose faith over fear. There was James Madison, quiet and thoughtful, whose notebooks had captured every word spoken in the room, and whose fingerprints were all over the Constitution's bones. There was Alexander Hamilton, the lone delegate from New York, still present, bold and articulate, whose ideas had often been too radical for the group, but whose loyalty to strong central governance was unwavering. The act of signing was almost ritualistic. Delegates dipped their quills in iron gall ink, straightened their backs, and leaned over the parchment. Their hands trembled, not from age, but from awareness. John Dickinson of Delaware, who had been too ill to attend toward the end, had his colleague George Read sign on his behalf. Each stroke of the pen committed them to a vision. Outside, Philadelphia remained unaware of the monumental act unfolding within. Horse carts clattered down the cobblestone streets. Vendors hawked fruits and cloth. But inside Independence Hall, the air was different, thick with meaning, echoing with an unspoken recognition that something larger than any individual was being born. As the final names were added, the document was lifted from the table and laid flat to dry. Silence lingered. The men looked at one another, not as strangers from distant states, but as co-authors of a shared destiny. Franklin broke the silence with a glance toward the high-backed chair where Washington had sat. On it, carved into the wood, was a golden sun. "I have often looked at that behind the president," he said, without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. "But now, at length, I have the happiness to know it is a rising sun." Those words would be remembered not just as a reflection of optimism, but as a declaration of purpose. They had labored through uncertainty, endured conflict, and brokered uneasy peace among rival visions. But now, with ink still drying on parchment, they stood on the edge of a new chapter in human governance. The Constitution, for all its imperfections, was now real. Not yet ratified, not yet law, but alive, breathed into being by the unity of those who signed. It would travel beyond the hall to be judged by the people, tested by state conventions, and debated in public squares. But it had its beginning. The signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787, was not the end of a process, but the beginning of a national journey. The men who signed it knew they had crafted something unprecedented, yet incomplete. They had taken the first step in giving structure to liberty. And as they stepped out of the hall into the sunlight, their silhouettes stretched long across the cobblestones of Philadelphia. Behind them, they left ink and parchment. Before them, uncertain, hopeful, and united future. The battle of words, the summer of 1787, was drawing to a close, and with it, the days of discussion, debate, and disagreement in the Pennsylvania State House. The convention had traversed a long, thorny path from ideological clashes to groundbreaking compromises, but one challenge still loomed before the delegates: drafting the final text of the Constitution. A battle unlike any other was about to begin, not with muskets or bayonets, but with ink, parchment, and the carefully chosen weight of every word. From ideas to ink, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Governor Morris, and a handful of key figures took up the task of transforming the months of debate into a coherent, enduring document. But the writing of the Constitution was not simply a matter of transcription. Every line had to be debated again, this time in the realm of language precise, durable, and legally sound. What should the preamble say? Who should it speak for? Edison proposed an opening that would reflect the new, united identity of the states. It was Governor Morris, however, who wielded the pen and rewrote the preamble into a stirring call. "We, the people of the United States." That phrase, so familiar today, was revolutionary in its time. It shifted the foundation of authority away from the individual states and placed it firmly in the hands of the people themselves. Some delegates balked. Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts questioned whether the people truly authorized them to make such a sweeping claim. But others, like George Mason, argued that if this nation were to survive and thrive, it needed a government rooted in the people's will, not just in state sovereignty. After much deliberation, Morris's words stood: a nation of balance. Then came the long hours of refining the structure, the three branches of government, the checks and balances, the powers enumerated and delimited. The debates reignited in the form of syntax. Should Congress have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper? What exactly did necessary mean? To one man, it sounded prudent. To another, dangerously vague. Words became weapons. Delegates clashed over commas, quarreled over clauses. Was the president's veto absolute, or could it be overridden? Was the judiciary empowered to interpret the law, or simply to apply it? Edmund Randolph, though once a staunch critic of centralized power, now argued for clarity and structure to avoid chaos. His legal mind insisted on clean definitions. Meanwhile, Madison continued to fight for ambiguity in places where too much rigidity might one day bind future generations. The slippery debate on slavery, nowhere was the power of language more fraught than in the matter of slavery. The word itself was never explicitly written in the Constitution, yet its shadow stretched across multiple clauses. When the issue of counting enslaved persons for representation arose, the infamous 3/5 compromise emerged an agreement that exposed the painful moral fracture at the heart of the convention. But how to encode it into language? How to mask this moral compromise with enough abstraction to satisfy the southern states without alienating the North? After much struggle, they settled on the phrase, all other persons, cold, vague, deliberate. It was language chosen not to illuminate, but to conceal. Some delegates, like Luther Martin, were disgusted. We are putting shackles in our very founding, he warned. But others argued this was the only way to preserve unity. The war of words here was also a war of principles. The final days of drafting. In early September, the Committee of Style, led by Gouverneur Morris, was given the task of polishing the final text. This small group worked in near silence, behind closed doors, condensing, clarifying, and, in many cases, subtly reshaping what the full convention had agreed upon. Morris, with his elegant prose and firm Federalist convictions, wrote most of the final language. He shortened convoluted clauses, cleaned redundant phrases, and chose words that lent the document a sense of gravity and permanence. The phrase, "we the people," was only the beginning. Throughout the document, Morris infused a rhythm and unity that belied the chaotic, divided nature of the convention itself. Signature of resolve on September 17, 1787, after months of argument and artistry, of tempers and treaties, the final draft was ready. It had taken 116 days of tireless effort. Still, not everyone was satisfied. 3 delegates, George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry, refused to sign. Mason had fought for a Bill of Rights and failed. Randolph believed the process had gone beyond its mandate. Gerry feared the seeds of monarchy. But 39 others stepped forward. The room was quiet as they signed. Franklin, old and frail, needed help to put his name to the parchment. Washington signed without comment. The Constitution was not perfect, none claimed it to be, but it was the best chance they had to form a more perfect union. As the delegates exited the hall, a curious woman reportedly asked Benjamin Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got? Republic or a monarchy?" Franklin's reply echoed through time. "A republic, if you can keep it." A document begins its journey outside the hall. The battle of words had only just begun. Now, the Constitution would face the people. It had to be ratified by at least 9 states. Essays would be written. Debates would be held in taverns, town halls, and state legislatures. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay would pen the Federalist Papers. Anti-Federalists would rise in opposition. But that, too, was part of the plan. The convention may have ended, but the great American conversation was just beginning, one in which every citizen, now and in the future, would become a participant. The Constitution was no longer just ink on parchment. It was a promise, a process, and, above all, a living idea. Its words, chosen so deliberately, would be argued, amended, and defended for centuries to come. And it all began with a battle fought, not with weapons, but with words. On the brink of division, the summer sun of 1787 hung heavily over Philadelphia. Yet the air inside the Pennsylvania State House was even heavier. Day after day, behind closed doors and shuttered windows, delegates from the 13 states argued, debated, and clashed over a single question: what shape should the new nation take? Outside, the streets buzzed with speculation, but inside, the tension was a silent storm, building toward a breaking point. George Washington, sitting at the head of the chamber as president of the convention, maintained his usual calm composure. But even he could feel the cracks widening. The unity that had been forged during the Revolution seemed now like fragile glass, brilliant, but ready to shatter. The core of the division lay between the large states and the small states. Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts wanted representation in the new legislature to be based on population. New Jersey, Delaware, and other small states feared such an arrangement would render them powerless. The debates grew sharp, sometimes personal, as men who once fought side by side now found themselves glaring across the room like opponents on a battlefield. James Madison, the meticulous Virginian with an ocean of notes, argued passionately for a strong central government, one that could unite the nation and prevent the chaos that had plagued the years under the Articles of Confederation. "We must not be a rope of sand," he insisted, his voice quiet but firm. It crossed from him. William Patterson of New Jersey warned that too much power in a central government could crush the smaller states. "We did not fight a king to kneel to another," he said, his words met with murmurs of approval from his allies. As the days stretched into weeks, tempers frayed. Some delegates spoke openly of walking away. The thought was terrifying. The convention failed. The fragile experiment of the United States might collapse entirely. Whispers of disunion began to swirl like dark clouds. It was then that Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman whose years and wit gave weight to his words, rose slowly to speak. The room quieted. "When a house is divided," he said, "its timbers weaken, and the winds will find their way in. We have built this house together with blood and sacrifice. Will we now tear it down because we cannot agree on the paint?" His metaphor drew nervous chuckles, but the truth behind it was undeniable. Still, words alone could not bridge the gap. The delegates needed a plan of structure that both large and small states could accept. It was Roger Sherman of Connecticut who proposed the compromise that would eventually bear his state's name, a bicameral legislature, with a House of Representatives apportioned by population and a Senate granting equal votes to each state. The idea did not resolve all disputes, but it planted a seed. Day by day, through negotiation and reluctant concessions, the vision of a unified structure began to take shape. There were still fierce arguments over slavery, commerce, and the powers of the presidency, arguments that would leave deep scars in the nation's future. But the threat of complete collapse slowly receded. Yet, outside the chamber, the city felt the strain. Philadelphia's taverns were filled with rumors. Merchants feared the talks would fail. Dock workers debated whether the new government would help or harm them. In the marketplace, farmers from the countryside eyed the delegates' carriages with suspicion, wondering if the men inside truly understood the struggles of ordinary citizens. One humid evening, as a thunderstorm rolled in from the west, Madison stood at a window, watching lightning arc across the sky. Beside him, Washington remained silent, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. "Do you think we can hold it together?" Madison finally asked. Washington's reply was measured. "Only if we remember why we bled." By late summer, after months of heat, strain, and fragile consensus, the convention began to draft the final text. Every clause, every word was weighed and debated. Men who had once nearly come to blows now sat side by side, quills scratching on parchment, shaping a document they hoped would outlast them. On September 17th, 1787, the delegates signed the Constitution. Franklin, too frail to stand unaided, was helped to his feet. Gesturing toward the carved sun on the back of Washington's chair, he remarked, "I have often looked at that sun during our sessions, wondering whether it was rising or setting. Today, I have the happiness to know it is a rising sun." But even as the ink dried, the unity within the room did not guarantee unity beyond it. Ratification would be a battle in itself. Outside those walls, in the towns and villages of the states, the debate was just beginning. Federalists would champion the new Constitution as the only hope for stability, while anti-federalists would warn it was a path toward tyranny. The convention had not erased the divisions. It had merely drawn a bridge over them. Whether that bridge would hold or whether the young nation would still plunge into the waters below was a question only the coming years could answer. For now, the delegates stepped out into the autumn sunlight, their faces lined with exhaustion and resolve. They had stood on the brink of division and for the moment pulled back. In the streets of Philadelphia, the sound of carriage wheels mixed with the calls of vendors and the laughter of children. The city moved forward, as did the country, into an uncertain future, carrying with it the fragile promise of unity. A new dawn, September 17th, 1787. The city of Philadelphia gleamed beneath the late summer dawn. After nearly 4 months of tense, exhausting debate, the men who had gathered together in Independence Hall finally reached the end of a long and arduous journey. The draft of the Constitution was complete. In that room, with its tall windows draped and shuttered to preserve secrecy, 39 of the 55 delegates placed their signatures upon a document that would shape history. Not all were in complete agreement, but each understood one thing: the young. America needed a solid foundation to withstand the tempests of a tumultuous world. This was not merely ink on parchment. It was a roadmap for a nation learning to govern itself. Benjamin Franklin, aged 81, frail and needing assistance to reach the table, spoke words that stirred many hearts. I have often looked at the chair of President Washington and wondered whether the sun carved upon it was rising or setting. But today, I know it is a rising sun. His words echoed like a greeting to the future. No one in that room could say for sure what lay ahead, but all knew this: if they did not begin today, there might never be a tomorrow for a united nation. From dim chambers to a yearning for light throughout the summer of 1787, The Constitutional Convention took place under strict secrecy. There were no reporters, no public access, and no delegate was allowed to divulge what transpired within those walls. Yet, outside the thick stone enclosure of Independence Hall, the people waited anxiously. Rumors whispered through the streets. Are they creating a new monarchy? Is Washington to be king? The fear of returning to monarchy still haunted many. That is why the draft of the Constitution was not the end, but merely the first step. The 7 articles written on that parchment still had to survive a grueling journey. Ratification by at least 9 of the 13 states. And to achieve that, the Constitution's supporters would have to fight with a new weapon, the written word. A battle to win hearts and minds. Less than a week after the Constitution was signed, fierce debates ignited everywhere, in taverns, churches, newspaper offices, and town halls. The opposition, known as the Anti-Federalists, feared a powerful federal government would threaten individual freedoms. They demanded a clear Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, the supporters, the Federalists, argued that swift action was necessary to prevent chaos. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. Every paragraph, every sharp argument was printed and circulated in newspapers from New York to Virginia. Madison wrote passionately, "We do not require a perfect government, only one capable of self-correction and endurance." Each state became a battlefield. Delaware was the first to ratify in December. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut followed. But New York and Virginia, the 2 most populous and influential states, posed the greatest challenges. Without their support, the Constitution might become a crippled compromise. Eventually, through persistent lobbying and the promise to later add a Bill of Rights, Virginia and New York relented. On June 21, 1788, when New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify, the Constitution officially took effect. A new nation had truly been born. George Washington, the first light. In the spring of 1789, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. He was not a man of political ambition, but one who bore the immense responsibility of a nation feeling its way through darkness. His inauguration in New York marked the true dawn of the American Republic. The new government began its work, organizing Congress, establishing the judiciary, creating systems for taxation, banking, and customs. Not everything ran smoothly. Fierce debates erupted among the emerging factions. But at least now they had a common rule book. The Constitution would serve as their compass. A living document, not merely the past. The Constitution of 1787 was never meant to be a fixed, untouchable relic. It has since been amended over 20 times, weathering civil war, economic collapse, world wars, civil rights movements, and the digital revolution. Its strength lies in its flexibility. Each generation of Americans has looked to the Constitution and asked anew, who are we? Where are we going? This ongoing dialogue is the very essence of democracy, ever unfinished, ever evolving. Philadelphia, today and tomorrow. If you visit Philadelphia today, you'll find Independence Hall still standing, modest and unassuming. The chair with the sun motif remains at the far end of the room, where Washington once presided silently. There are no dazzling monuments, no gilded thrones, but there, in that quiet space, you can feel something profoundly real. This is where a new dawn once began, not through gunfire, but through words, patience, and a shared longing for unity. Conclusion: a new dawn is not merely the light that breaks after a night of division and instability. It is the beginning of a journey that never truly ends. The journey of building, defending, and renewing the democratic dream. And that dream, born in the summer of 1787, continues to live on in every chapter of American history. Egocy on parchment. The room was quiet, except for the soft rustle of parchment under the quill's tip. Outside, the early morning light of September bathed Philadelphia streets in a gentle glow. Inside, the air felt heavy, though the Constitution had been signed. Its journey was far from over. The ink had dried, but the debates, hopes, and fears it carried would echo for generations. James Madison sat at his desk, his gaze fixed on the folded copy before him. The smell of ink and parchment still lingered, reminding him of those tense summer days when words were wielded like weapons. He knew every sentence had been forged through argument, compromise, and, at times, painful concession. This document was no mere paper. It was the fragile framework of a nation still learning how to stand. Meanwhile, in a small print shop nearby, presses worked tirelessly. Sheets bearing the words of the new Constitution rolled out one after another, each destined for towns and cities where eager or skeptical eyes would devour them. Some would read with pride, others with suspicion, but none could deny the weight of the moment. The words now belonged to the people, and their verdict would shape the country's fate. George Washington, though outwardly calm, felt the gravity pressing upon him. The ink on the parchment might be permanent, but the unity it symbolized was not. He had seen the fractures north and south, large states and small, key Federalists and anti-Federalists. Sand knew that paper alone could not bind hearts. That would require trust, patience, and time. Across the colonies, taverns buzzed with talk. Farmers argued with merchants, sailors with lawyers. Was this Constitution a safeguard of liberty or a clever trap for the unwary? The debates were fierce, but beneath the noise lay a truth for the first time. The people were weighing the architecture of their own government, not one imposed from afar. In his quiet study, Madison closed his eyes for a moment. He imagined the generations to come children, who would never know the smoke of revolution, but would live under the freedoms and restraints these words provided. He hoped they would understand that this parchment was not an ending, but a beginning, a promise that each era would have to renew. Outside, the church bells began to ring, their sound carrying across cobblestone streets. The city stirred, unaware that within its walls a fragile experiment in self-government had just taken its first breath. The parchment lay still on the desk, its ink dark and resolute. It could not speak, but it carried a chorus of those who dared to dream that a nation could govern itself. And though the quills had been set down, the writing was not finished. The true story of America would be penned not in ink, but in the actions of its people.